Welcome to Tech Captains. I am Ron Danenberg, and today with Gareth Thomas, we are excited to welcome Adam Horner, CTO and co-founder of Sinova Technology. A year and a half ago, I interviewed Adam for the previous Written Tech Captain series before the podcast, and now he's back to share more insights on this podcast. Adam brings over a decade of experience in tech leadership, having co-founded companies like Sinova and previously building a company in the same industry as Coleno, the company I started. And I think that's how I first found him. And his expertise lies in, according to his LinkedIn at least, in accelerating software development for startups through strategic guidance, people leadership, and optimized processes. So today we're diving into your journey, Adam, and your vision for the future of technology. So welcome back.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
To start with, like, what are you up to these days? You relocated to Sweden.
Yeah, that's right. About 5 years ago, I moved to Sweden. So I've been working for the last 18 months, as you said, helping companies to build software faster, deliver features quicker. Well, that's often the main thing that people want, but obviously there's a lot more behind it. And I focus on three things, really: strategy, people, and processes, as you mentioned before. And I do that through two basic services. One is as a fractional CTO, so working for multiple startups simultaneously. And the other one is CTO coaching. It's probably the smallest part of my job, but it's the bit that I'm the most passionate about. I absolutely love helping CTOs level up and deliver more.
It brings me some questions because I see a lot of like CTOs or experienced tech person today going into those fractional roles, and I think we had one or two before, Gareth, if I remember well, or coaching. Like, do you feel like it's just a natural progression, or like what why did you decide to do this rather than being permanent full-time hands-on techie?
Well, I was a full-time CTO, and that's the reason I moved to Sweden, was to join Ad Phoenix, or a company that's now rebranded to Realforce. So that's what I was doing. But the thing that really changed was that I think with the change in the cost of money, when money got more expensive, a lot of startups had to suddenly start thinking about being profitable, whereas before it was just growth, growth, growth. And so the amount of money that was going out the door on salaries and people became much more of an issue, quite rightly. So the race to profitability started. And so having an expensive CTO 5 days a week, it becomes something that you have to question at that point. And I think my company at Phoenix, as well as a lot of other companies, started questioning that approach and sort of thinking, well, could we do with 3 days a week? And that's what I did. I went 3 days a week with them. And then obviously suddenly had to find work to do for the other 2 days. And then I was like, so what am I? What am I doing? It's a question that probably quite a few of your listeners have come to at some point in their career. And I went out looking and found out, okay, this thing is called fractional CTO these days. And it probably used to be called technical consultant or management consulting. The new buzzword is fractional CTO. And that's how I came into it. And I think as a profession, it's been around for quite a while. But I do think that the age ceiling has come down for it. There's a lot more people doing it. I think the other thing that's changed as well is that startups and companies, because of the change in the cost of money, are much more open to the idea of having a part-time executive leader. Whereas prior to that, all the VCs were pushing for employer people. They need to have equity. They need to be in the business as well as working on the business. I think now that has shifted when people realize that if you want somebody with 25, 30 or more years of experience, they're going to cost a lot if they're full-time. Maybe you don't need them full-time. You can get them part-time. And I think the demand has changed. And the number of people who can bring that kind of experience to companies has also changed. More so in the US than here in Europe, but it's changing here in Europe too.
Do you think that maybe over the last sort of 10 years, there's been more of a growth of non-technical founders, where then, bringing in this sort of fractional role becomes really helpful to them in those sort of early days? Do you think that's another thing driving it maybe?
It's quite possibly part of the drive, but I definitely think there are more non-technical founders coming into the market for a couple of reasons. One is the barriers to building a technical product and building a company have both come down so much. It was the case, let's go back 10 years. You needed a team of 10, 15 engineers to build something sort of on the low end, and then you needed a team of 5, 10 people to sell the thing. So your barriers to entry for a company were quite high. Now, if you start a business, your founder can do marketing and selling with the aid of a lot of the tools like ChatGPT and many other automations that are available in the industry. Cost of CRMs on their own has come down significantly, and the costs of building software has dropped. It's plummeted like a stone. There's much better practices. There's well-trodden paths. There's low-code and no-code solutions that allow you to test out ideas and iterate fast. So the kinds of companies that are coming to VCs are coming to them at a much more mature stage than they used to. So you can build something without being a technical expert, without having an awful lot of technical expertise on your side, and have already validated your idea. And it's changing the game completely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think that without someone who is somewhat seasoned and experienced, you could, without that background, very easily do one or two little things that could really trip you up later on. So it's probably very helpful for a lot of those people.
And is it realistic, because you've started companies, you've been on your own for coaching, you've held senior roles in other companies, or more low level or junior, rather, I would say, roles at the start of your career. Is it realistic that so many people want to start a company?
There's a lot more people who have less reasons to be blocked from it, right? That the barriers to entry are lower and the cost of failing is lower as well. What's the worst that can happen these days? You lose some investor money. It's becoming a lot more normalized. Very few people end up themselves personally going bankrupt as a result of a business going out of operation. There's a lot more possibilities to exit a business, whether that's being acquired by another business, another startup in the same space, or by private equity outfits who know the problems you're facing and understand exactly what needs to be done to solve that and take it to the next level. So it's a lot easier to exit businesses too. Therefore, the risk of starting a business is coming down. And then on top of that, there's a lot of social policies that are making it easier to run your own business. I mean, look at the UK. It takes you 10 minutes online to create a business and start it. Wow, that's easy. Countries like Sweden, where I am, you can be paid for a year to step out of your job to try and do your own thing, and your job is held for you. If the whole thing fails within that year, you can step back into that job. So I think the risks for starting startups have come right down. And, it's no accident that countries like Sweden have one of the highest ratios of unicorns, billion-dollar market cap startups to the size of the population.
In terms of I would say the coaching part of it, because that's a very different role than the fractional or consultancy role, right? It's much more like emotional intelligence, understanding people. I know there's a lot in the CTO role about understanding people, obviously, but coaching and inspiring another senior person to do some things, or go through their ego rather than explaining actual facts and technical things, it's quite different.
I think so, but I think there's also two elements to it. And part of it is structural to the engineering industry, which is that if you're a CEO, if you're a CFO, if you're a CMO, so, executive, marketing, finance, these levels of executive roles, it's very traditional, very accepted to have a coach. Whereas in the technical environment, it's not nearly so normal. I mean, you learn what you need to on Stack Overflow, right? Why would you need a coach as a CTO? So culturally, there is less coaching. Best practice, therefore, is lower. And so, therefore, there's a whole load of things that need to be understood and learned. On the same side, Gareth, you were saying that it's kind of easier to step into the role of a CTO, and it's easier to get there without having gone through an awful lot of leadership, learning, and experience. And so by the time you get there, maybe there are sometimes quite some big gaps in the breadth of what you've learned up until that point. So the coaching that I do is, honestly, it's part coaching, just like you mentioned, but it's also part teaching. What are the things you're actually facing on the job? How do you avoid some of those pitfalls that Gareth mentioned that are fairly obvious? And that level of sort of crossing over between coaching and teaching is the space where I operate in best. So, I mean, if we think about the growth of a CTO, you're often at the low end, very early in the startup, you're often the maker. You're creating code. You're often the only software engineer at the beginning. Then you grow up to be the expert. You've got a team of people, others working on it, but you've got the most experience by that stage. And then you start to step into what people traditionally think of as a CTO. You've now got a team of, let's say, 10 or 12, maybe just beginning to grow into 2 teams. You're managing a lot more than you were. On a further stage, you end up in leadership, where you're genuinely leading part of the company. You're getting much more involved in the executive team or the executive leadership team at that point. And then at the very top end, you've got the pure strategic roles. You're thinking more of an enterprise at that stage. So there's all this very long growth curve as a CTO. And then there's quite a growth curve to get into the CTO role, and encompasses two areas. Right? So one side is much more technology focused, architect, perhaps you're working on the experimentation innovation side, leading traditionally to the CTO role. And on the other side, you've got the more people approach, like you were saying, Ron. So looking at the culture, looking at the processes, tends to culminate in a VP engineering role. And in awesome engineering organizations, you've got this dynamic duo at the top. You've got the CTO and you've got the VP of engineering. One looking at strategy and processes, innovation, technology, and the other looking at people, culture, processes, efficiency. And so that, even within CTO, there's a big path of growth that diverges. And helping people through all those different bits, that's what I love doing.
So I'm just laughing because you were saying, the VP of engineering and dynamic duo. I'll have to mention that to BK, who's my VP of engineering where I am at the moment. So he'll find that quite funny. But we do work very, very closely. We're almost like, joined at the hip, and it's brilliant. So I just want to go back to something you said a little earlier. You mentioned Sweden, and I was actually going to ask you a question relating to this. So looking at the tech scene in the UK, we can see a lot of successful fintechs, insurtechs. I mean, that's not surprising considering London's history. We see a lot of price comparison sites, which, while I've used them, I just hate the fact that all we seem to generate are price comparison sites. I mean, it has to end one day. Maybe price comparison sites comparing price comparison sites. But I struggle to name companies outside of those spaces. The US still has, I think, by far the widest breadth. So why are there not a wider range of unicorns out of the UK, do you think? And I'm looking at Sweden there because I keep seeing all these things talking about Sweden now. I think all of these companies that have come because of Spotify and various other things. I'm really interested to get your opinion on that.
And, I had a very different opinion 5 years ago when I was just leaving the UK than I do now 5 years on, having seen it from this side of the North Sea. And I think what it comes down to is that I'm going to do something awkward. I'm going to characterize the UK as an awkward teenager. And let me explain what I mean by that. If you look at the population size of the UK, you've got 65 million-ish, something like that. And the US, you've got 360 million. It's an order of magnitude different in terms of the population size. And on the other side, you've got countries like Sweden, Lithuania, Norway, Denmark. Like 10 million is the biggest population amongst that group of, otherwise quite digital peoples. And so there's two things that happen in the Nordic countries. One is the whole country's been very digitized for a long time. The speeds of broadband have been, historically mind-blowing compared to what was possible in the UK. 100 megabit broadband, common here in Sweden. It's still sort of the top end in the UK. And then you've got the size of the population. You've got a population of 10 million. If you want to grow, you've got to look outside the country. And you've got to look at where the next best place to grow is, when the obvious thing is you look at the US. So you expand from your country of 10 million people or less, and you immediately start looking at a growth market the size of the US that's huge, has a common language across it. And that's one of the reasons why I think there's this huge growth. Whereas in the UK, it's like, well, 65 million people, it's a pretty good sized market, right? We can grow into the UK at the risk of growing parochially with UK standards and UK expectations and not needing to cross that bridge to the really huge population in the US. And I think that's probably one of the reasons. And it's that sort of positioning in the middle, which is why I call it the awkward teenager. It's just in terms of the size of the population and the addressable market.
Yeah. It's like the middle bear, isn't it? Basically the three bears kind of thing. That's interesting. I haven't thought about that before, but that makes sense.
Yeah. And to jump back on something that you just said, like that the first engineer of a startup becomes go up and up in terms of managerial skill, even if it's not seniority or position. But is it realistic that because you were the first engineer, you become a CTO manager completely hands off on the code and the actual tech?
Is it realistic? Yes, but there's a few preconditions that make it a lot more likely to succeed. And there's plenty of examples that prove against what I'm about to say. So yes, there's plenty of examples where it also doesn't work. But let's take the example where it does work and kind of think through that one. So often you end up with somebody who's been working as a leader. They've done coding. They're a good developer. They have worked as a leader. they get to that point where they're thinking, I'm beginning to hit this ceiling, right? There's a CTO in my company. That CTO is great. I don't really have an obvious path to become a CTO here, but I really want to be a CTO. So what do? You don't look up, you look down. You go, I'll go, either be a founder or I'll join somebody else as their first tech employee. And you go back to being hands-on code, writing code, building the thing, using new tools. Hey, learning's always fun. So it's kind of attractive from that perspective. But you've already got that experience of being a leader, of being somebody who's at least slightly strategic, even if you haven't got the executive level of experience yet. And so therefore, from that perspective, they start off knowing that the first few, maybe years even, of growth path is predictable, known, and comfortable for them. And so therefore they only start hitting, the discomfort zone after that period of time when they've got past where they were in their previous role. So from that perspective, yes, it's quite normal to do that. On the flip side, though, the sort of the points that disprove it, let's say, for example, you're in your early 20s, in one of your first jobs, you've been an individual contributor coder up until now, and your mate who's just come out of their business degree, they just finished their MBA, and says, hey, come and be my first builder. That person has a much tougher growth path to try and keep on that same trajectory. And so it's much less likely for that person to grow through those roles first time round without hitting their own ceiling or their own limits that prevent them from growing at the same pace as the startup. And so in those environments, you've got two options. Either, you swap the CTO when that person outgrows their growth capacity at that point in time. You struggle on, you get them a coach.
Yeah.
And that's the other way, is to bridge that gap, is to get somebody a coach to help them accelerate through that. And that's why I say that I tend to do coaching and teaching, because there's both elements in there. There's the personal growth through that the roles of the expectations. What are my fears? What am I worried about? How do I get stuck in my head? And then there's the other aspects of, what is there that let's use Rumsfeld, right? What do I not know that I don't know? And that's where a coach who's being a teacher can help you. Hey, look at this framework. Have you heard of this before? Have you thought about that? Have you read this blog? And sometimes it's as simple as reading some stuff that's already out there that you just haven't had the experience to come across yet.
And what advice would you give? What piece of advice would you give to an engineer, 10, 15 years working experience, who want to move into a more managerial role?
I'd say mindset is probably the most important thing. So here's the way that I characterize your career, right? It's like a great big pyramid. And the pyramid has at its pinnacle the thing that you want to do, right? And in order to build that pyramid higher, you don't push it up from the top, because that's the bit that you're good at already. You push it up from the bottom. And the pyramid is wider and wider at the base. Why? Because if you build your skills in one single niche, if the industry shifts to the side, you suddenly got no foundation and you're going to fall from where you are. The broader your level of experience and the wider your base of knowledge, of background experiences and supporting information, supporting experience that you've got into that thing that you do really well, the more stable, more structured, and the more confident you're going to be in that role. So I'd say the most important thing for somebody who's got that level of experience, mindset, broadening that skill base, becoming aware of the gaps in your knowledge and experience, and deliberately trying to fill those in, or making sure you've got people alongside you who fill it in for you. Whether that's a colleague, a coach, a leader, getting the right people to make sure that your pyramid is as robust as you can be, so that you can, if you think about it from that point of view as well, you spend very little time doing the thing that gives you that ultimate satisfaction right at the peak of your pyramid. But if you don't have the rest of it, it's going to be very rare that you do that.
And you sent us a book before we started this podcast that you would recommend for people to read, and that book is Turn the Ship Around from David Marquette. We actually had that book at least once from Tim Richardson recently from Playroll. I don't know if we had it even more, but I suppose now that it's coming back, I will have to read it. Like, I won't have the choice. So what's your reason?
I'm in good company then. So the thing I love about the book is the basic premise of the book is to try and instill in everybody within a team, within an organization, to come with a mindset of I intend to. The book itself is a really good story. It's basically about a submarine captain who became got themselves in charge of one of the worst performing submarines in the Pacific Fleet, and how he overcame the structural adversity he had to get to the point where he had one of the best performing submarine crews in the Pacific Fleet. And essentially he did it by flipping the rule book. The rule book there was that, in the Navy, as you can imagine, it's quite rigid. In the submarines, even more so, because it's a very regulated environment being a nuclear submarine. And basically everybody had to know how to do their job perfectly. There was manuals to follow, etc. But it was very prescriptive. Yeah. And what he did is he sort of flipped that on his head and said, I want you to come to me, each person within the ship, and tell me what it is that you intend to do. Forcing people to think for themselves through what they had to do, rather than just being told what they had to do. And this changed the mindset of all the people. Like, I'm going to figure it out first, then I'm going to go present my plan to whoever my leader is. And then the leader's going to say, okay, great, go do that. Or, okay, have you thought about this? What are the consequences of that? Which creates an automatic learning moment. And so therefore it's this culture of continuous personal improvement by coming with a mindset of, I'm in charge of what I'm going to do. I'm not going to follow anything blindly. And it's the kind of thing that when you get that culture to ripple down through a whole reporting structure, it just changes things forward to everybody being in charge of their own thing. You end up with a much more innovative workforce because they're thinking for themselves and they take ownership for themselves. And it manifests itself in some of the smallest things. Like we say to people, you're in charge of your diary. Like a lot of people end up getting, crammed with meetings, too much going on. You're in charge of your diary. Most people think, no, I'm not. Everybody else is in charge of my diary. They're the ones who send me the meeting invites. But with this idea of I intend to, it's this idea that I'm in control, and like people control of their diaries, like telling them to, when they have this mindset.
I guess I'll buy it on Amazon this weekend.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
obviously sold it well.
Yeah. I suppose it's related to the idea of don't bring me a problem, bring me a solution.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly that. Yeah.
Yeah. So just talking then.
Is that something you found yourself, Gareth, in areas?
What's that? Yeah. I mean, it is, and actually, I think as well as you get into, especially going into fast growing tech companies, there's a lot of problems, right? Every day there are problems, huge numbers of them, and so when you get people that you work with or work for you, who instead of saying, "Oh, this is broken, I got to fix that," this doesn't work over here. It's like coming to you saying, I know we've got this thing, but I know how I'm going to deal with it. It changes the velocity of the business because you all can now work so much faster because the problems are all kind of there's almost like much more of a parallelism going on. So yeah, it's I think it's definitely a good thing to try and instill in people, come with a solution, not a problem. But I wanted to ask you about another thing that you wrote. So you wrote about the 3 predictors of high performance tech teams. And I thought this was very interesting. So you said they were aligned, people that were aligned around strategy, trust, and responsiveness, which I thought was really good. But then I was thinking about it and I thought, I wonder if there should be a 4th added here. And I couldn't figure out what to call it. So I'm going to call it environmental. And this is sort of looking at things from a coding perspective, right? So keeping the environment as friction-free as possible, reducing the time and barriers, from the point that an engineer pushes commit to that code being in production and running in production, right? And I just wondered what your thoughts were around that sort of pillar, or maybe that already fits under one you had there. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that very much comes down to the responsiveness, because we can think of responsiveness about being responsive to you, and I'm going to answer your questions quickly, honestly, truthfully. But we can also think about responsiveness in terms of the processes that we have. When I commit code, how quick is the system responsive to me to tell me that my test broke? And how much impact does that have on others? In other words, it's responsive to being open to others being able to work on their own branch and not have a clashing challenge. So I think the idea of responsiveness is something that is bigger than just me talking to you or providing feedback on your things. I think it's also about the systems and how we expect them to be responsive to us as an individual. And then how does the whole organization revolve around that? How responsive are we as engineering to customer support or, technical sales? And if we think about the whole thing as a set of processes that interlock as a concept, I think it helps you get your mindset around why CI/CD continuous testing is so important. And it's the systems being responsive to you too. How easy is our Jira set up to use? Do I have loads of friction in the way I use it? Or is it responsive? Does it help me actually do my job without getting in my way?
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I think you're right.
A really common complaint of Jira.
Yeah. And I didn't like the fact that I might have been breaking your nice sort of 3 pillars, because we all know that looks more pleasing to the eye, doesn't it? 3 things rather than 4 things. And then
it is
yeah,
an oversimplification quite deliberately, isn't it? Right?
yeah. And then another one, you organised a lecture called Beyond, which is kind of timely. So I think there was a lecture you organised called Beyond Code. And you said AI will transform software development, something no one doubts. Don't think any of us doubt that. We're seeing it happen before our very eyes. And it will happen faster than anyone could have imagined. Spine chilling. So my own take on this, and I went back, because I wrote an article on this over a year ago, and I went back and read it after I saw your comment. And I kind of was thinking that the biggest upheaval will come in DevOps within the next 5 years, say, for a number of reasons. And I'm just wondering what your take is on it. Where do you see the big changes coming, let's say, in the next 5 years, if you look at the various areas of engineering, software engineering?
Yeah, well, if we look at what Johan was predicting, who was the one who presented, he's the director of human-centered AI at RISE, which is a research institute of Sweden. And he was the one who presented and did this fabulous talk on what the changes in AI mean for software development over the next 3 years. I mean, 3 years is his horizon. Like, beyond that, he says his crystal ball is too hard to see because it's moving so fast. But basically, he said that we're not going to be writing code ourselves anymore in any language other than English, effectively, from very shortly, because it's so capable already. From my perspective, I think what's happening is we will see it in all sorts of different ways in engineering. In how long it takes us to do things, the level of collaboration. It'll be like having a number of extra team members working for us from the AI, building sections of code, debugging code for us. Documentation will become less of an issue when the AI can, read, understand, digest, and explain the code to us so quickly. Debugging will change, but none of that is visible outside engineering, particularly. I think my personal view on the way that it's going to become most visible to the rest of anybody who's outside tech is in the ratio between currently what is product and currently what is engineering. I think engineering, what it means to be an engineer, is going to change completely. But the way it'll probably manifest itself is in the ratio of people. Right now, we have a team, or let's say we have a squad, and typically you'll see, let's say, 2 back-end engineers, 2 front-end engineers. You'll have 1 product person, and you'll have a fraction of a designer involved in that squad and team. And sometimes you might even have a DevOps or a fraction of a DevOps person assigned to that team as well. I think that ratio is going to change drastically, and we're already seeing it. If you look at the market, there's way more product people on the market looking for roles right now than there are engineering people. And I think that ratio is going to push even further. I think we're going to end up with a ratio more like 2 product people, a fraction of a product designer, or maybe 1 product designer, 1 engineer who does everything from front end, back end, DevOps, automation, because they can use the AIs to such an advantage that they can just go so fast in delivering features that understanding what the user wants and needs is going to become the hardest thing to do. And the ratio of people needed is just going to change so completely. So all those people who are product people on the market right now, hold on. I think you're going to be in demand fairly shortly.
Okay. Another thing then that was interesting that you wrote, so you did a podcast, I think a few months ago, and you were talking about systemic communication. And you said, people gravitate to a familiar way of communicating, right? And that would be good to have a cultural foundation, a way of writing. You sort of singled up GitHub and Stripe, but I was reading that and I thought, I wonder if the next problem coming is actually reading, because I saw an article on education recently, and they said that people coming through sort of Gen Z, TikTok, social media use, it's creating a space where attention spans are dropping. And the ability to deep read is becoming scarcer. And I wonder if that's going to have a significant impact in disciplines like ours, right? Where we're going to have deep technical documentation, user manuals, and then people who just can't focus enough to understand what's being said in them, and maybe can't even write them.
Yeah, but Gareth, I think on a deeper philosophical level, you can see in history, a lot of the time where civilizations struggle, the illiteracy rate rises. And I think in today's age, when we talk about illiteracy rate, we have to think about the TikTok and the attention span that you mentioned, not the actual reading words, but people who watch like 30 seconds video. I mean, I know someone who's 21 and who told me that they can't watch that video. It's 5 minutes. It's way too long. And I know of somebody else who watched a bunch of TikTok too at the same time. Like, this is illiteracy in the 21st century.
Interesting.
And to think, well, how does this fit into the historical context? Because I think people didn't used to read and write at all. If you go back far enough, everything was laid down and told through stories. And stories were the way in which information was relayed, the way knowledge was relayed from one generation to the next through stories around a campfire. So if you think about it, reading is actually not a natural skill that humans have had. It's something we've developed since Gutenberg and the printed press, when reading became a mass technology that was able to be used by everybody. And I think, so it's almost like a revert to the norm when you look at history on a long enough timescale. And I imagine that way back then, long stories might have been part of the thing, but a long story had to be engaging. And I think what we're probably seeing at the moment is the way that information is consumed is changing radically. It's moving back to short stories. Yeah, sure, some of them are 5 seconds, 15 seconds. But I also think the way in which we generate and summarize and distill knowledge is becoming more important. But at the same time, it's becoming easier. With AI, Gen AI can take a mass of data and distill it down to the salient points. We're seeing entire books reduced to 15 minutes on services like Headway and other similar things, where you pay a fee to the service, you get onto it. You want to read a book, you've only got 15 minutes, you go through the little short course and you get all the salient points out of it. So the way in which we consume is changing. So therefore, the way in which we document and write about systems, solutions, or problems is changing. How much do we actually write? How much do we leave as just the bullet points? And how much do we leave so that the next person who comes along can give the context that they need to the AI to summarize it and give them the salient points, what they're trying to do at the points in time. So communication is changing radically. And I think where I talked about systemic communication, which is using systems to communicate, is allowing people to gather a quick state of the world from structured data normally. So systemic communication looks like things like GitHub issues, Jira tickets, maybe it's the state of your linear workflow, it's your product updates. And so it's the way in which we input data into those, set them, create them, and have the reports to kick the data back out again. That's the bit that I think is going to change. And there's a discipline needed in keeping that up to date. I mean, how many times you talk to a sales team and hear the sales leader complaining about their salespeople not keeping the CRM up to date? That's a failure in process for the systemic communication that's needed for the leadership level. And I think we have something very similar with Jira. We have something very similar with Slack and other systemic communication methods. So I think it's just a case of communication changing, consumption patterns are changing, but also the technology that allows us to communicate is changing radically right now.
Well, I do hope people listen to this half-hour podcast, though.
Yeah, and I say just the final point of it. I'm just wondering, so if this future of there's no coders, right? There's just AI writing code. So then there's just AI documenting AI written code for other AIs to read and consume, and just humans are out of the loop completely at that point, right? So we have to worry.
So like Johan said in his talk for the CTO Craft event, reading code is still going to be important. Why? Debugging and proof. So when things go wrong, we still need to understand. So if we have a situation where we talk to the AI in English and it just spits out something really raw and close to the machine, like, for example, assembler language, right? Or even just machine instructions, there's very little way of untangling that to the original instruction and understanding what the intention was or the intermediary steps from the method. So therefore, debugging when something goes wrong, especially in a complex system, especially when it's really complicated like a parallel processing system, is going to be near impossible. So I think the intermediary representation of code is going to persist. And I think people are going to need to understand the fundamentals as senior engineers, memory management, parallel processing, data structures. These are going to be the important knowledge to understand as, people who are systems engineers or systems developers. But will they need to be able to generate code? Probably not, because our programming language will become English. Will we need to understand and read code? Oh, yes. I think that's still going to be important. I think it's got fun implications for what about the proliferation of languages that we code in? Are we going to hit, the peak and the limit? Are we now going to be stuck at Rust, JavaScript and C#? Is that it? We're never going to evolve further than that. Or is it going to evolve into something else that's easier for AI to use and easier for humans to read? It'll be fun. I don't have a crystal ball on that one yet.
I mean, Adam, you explained things clearly, and I truly enjoyed your insights. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun.
Well, thank you. And
thanks, Adam.
And for everybody listening, we'll be back in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.